So let's talk about Wild Beyond the Witchlight. This is an adventure that I wasn't expecting much from, really. I really enjoyed the idea of it. I liked the carnival theme to the first chapter. I was expecting a lot of great artwork. The cover art looked great. But I have a really hit and miss relationship with 5th edition adventures. A lot of them I find have a really good premise, but then they really fail in the execution and the delivery of information. Descent into Avernus is a great example of this. The hook of go to hell, really cool, but the opening chapters of the book are a complete mess, and running it requires a fairly significant amount of tweaking. Well, I'm happy to say that Wild Beyond the Witchlight blew away my expectations of an adventure book from 5th edition. This video is sponsored by the Delver's Guide to Beastworld, now on Kickstarter. More on them later. We're going to get into all the nitty gritty of it, but I want to start up front by saying if you're wondering whether you should buy this, if you're a dungeon master specifically thinking whether or not you should buy this, I think that it's worth the price of the book alone simply to look at how the story and how the adventure is structured. In a lot of ways, the structure is really simple, but more than any other official 5th edition adventure I've read, this sets it out in a way that you can actually run it really easily. So what do I mean by that? Well, the book sets up the adventure in such a way that you have a lot of options. I know in the run-up to the release, a lot of time was devoted to talking about how you can go ahead and play through this adventure and you don't have to do any combat. I really thought that was going to be an afterthought, but reading through it, I realized that they designed this adventure in the mindset of you will not fight in this adventure. If you are fighting, that is the secondary way that you're going to achieve your goals, versus talking to people and carrying out plans and do schemes and things like this and make deals. Those are the ways that they intend you to get through all of these challenges. Almost every major challenge presented in the book is resolved in a non-violent way as kind of the first way to do it. And then there's almost like a footnote that says, right, okay, if you fight, here is what happens if you fight. But it's presented as a secondary way of dealing with problems. And while I know there are a lot of systems out there that deal with problems in a game like this, in non-violent solutions, this is really the first time we've seen official material from 5th edition that takes such a non-violent approach, and I'm really here for it. It makes for much more interesting story beats because every character has something that they want, or some piece of information that they want to get, or some kind of task that they want your player characters to achieve, and you can use those to achieve the player character goals rather than just swinging your swords in. It'll be a very different style of gameplay than I think a lot of people are used to. I actually think this would be a great adventure to run with kids because it puts those non-violent options right at the forefront. So we're going to dive into some spoiler territory here. If you don't want to know anything about the book, first, what are you doing watching this video? Go watch something else. I'll put a card up here for a different video for you to go and watch. But I want to talk about some of the ways that this book really impressed me. So starting right at the front of the book, I was really impressed by the way the book set up the quest hooks for this adventure. A lot of the time in 5th edition adventures, and a lot of adventures overall, I find a problem in that the hooks for your players are just kind of, this thing is happening, your players are gonna be interested. You know, there's a lot of 5th edition adventures where you can struggle to see why the players would care. Like Avernus is a great example. All the players start in a different location to where the main action is happening, and it's just kind of a snowball effect that gets them involved rather than being directly tied to it. Wild Beyond the Witchlight solves this by giving you 2 suggested options for you to be invested. One of them is a really boilerplate, someone has hired you to do a thing, and that is by far the most boring option. The other option is that as children, your characters went to the Witchlight Carnival and lost something, and now as adults they have returned there hoping to find it, and hoping to find this thing that they've lost will lead them into the Feywild and on this adventure. This plays out throughout the entire book, but it's got a really fairy tale or almost like children's story feel to it. It really reminded me of the movie Labyrinth, where something is taken and the protagonist has to go into this magical world, interact with these fantastic creatures, overcome obstacles and recover that which was lost. And I actually think if I were going to run Wild Beyond the Witchlight, I would really love to have one of the things that was lost be a character's younger sibling. There's a whole separate thing with children in the Witchlight and where they can be and how they don't age and how no harm can come to them, which is a really good way to keep that sibling safe and kind of contained. But I think the motivation of finding a child as the thing that you've lost, incredibly powerful, great way to hook your players. The list of suggested things that it says, oh, your players could lost, is really interesting. It's much more esoteric than I was expecting. It's things like your ability to keep secrets, or 3 inches of your height, like really weird stuff like that that I wouldn't have thought as a player, here's what I could have lost, but stuff that you would actually have the desire to get back and could propel some of that whimsy that is scattered throughout the adventure. My only complaint really with this hook system is that the book says when you've lost something, you also lose the ability to gain inspiration, and I really like giving my players inspiration, so losing access to that until what could be really close to the end of the adventure, that really doesn't sit right with me. That's probably not something I would pursue in terms of them getting inspiration. I might look into the minor curses that it suggests instead and give the afflicted players, the players that have lost something, some kind of minor curse. Another thing the start of the book does really well is to present player options that are really fitting for the theme. So there's obviously the 2 playable races, the fairy and the Herongon, but the backgrounds that it suggests are really interesting as well. There is the Phalos, that is someone who as a child found their way into the realm of the Fae and they keep some of that connection. And then there is the Witchlight Hand, someone that has worked at the Witchlight Carnival for a period of time, and that is how they're connected. And by incorporating those 2 backgrounds as well as the Lost Things hook, I think you're going to end up with a group of characters that are genuinely invested in this story. They have connections to the carnival where they're going to start, and they have tangible reasons to want to go off onto this adventure, because too many times I find that players make characters that don't have a strong drive to go and pursue the main story in an adventure like this. So why is this adventure a masterclass in adventure writing? Well, it's because of the way that it disseminates information to you, the Dungeon Master. A lot of the times adventures are really dense in information, and it feels like you have to read the entire thing front to back and frequently kind of jump backwards and forwards to figure out where you are and where you're going. One of the things that I really liked about this adventure is it seemed much more geared to a Dungeon Master than a lot of the previous modules. So included in the book, you get a story tracker. This is a couple of sheets of paper with a place for you to kind of track information that's been happening. It's a really simple thing, and on its own it wouldn't be particularly interesting, but the body of the text also makes reference for when you as a Dungeon Master should be noting things down. So things will happen in the story and you'll get a little DM sidebar that says, right, note this information in your story tracker, in your DM story tracker, because this information is going to be relevant later on, and that makes running the whole adventure much easier, because you don't necessarily need to read chapters and chapters ahead. You can just read the 1 chapter that you're on, and then anything that you're going to need later on is going to be noted on your story tracker. Similarly, all of the important NPCs have little NPC cards with role-playing tips on them that you can print out or photocopy and keep a copy of those cards behind the screen, so that anytime your players encounter one of these characters, you've got reference for how they're going to behave without having to go flick through the book. That is a really small detail, but it's massive in terms of runnability of an adventure, because you don't have to go flicking through the book. You can have everything you need right at your fingertips. The book is also surprisingly modular. Modular might not be the right word, but there's a lot of choice. So a lot of situations in the book will present different versions of events depending on what you're doing. So a great example is most of the primary plot points, you get a different version depending on which of the two hooks your players took, but then also depending on what actions your players have taken throughout the course of the adventure. So at several points there are multiple kind of options for your players to choose for how they approach a problem, and then later on it will say, right, you've come to this next plot point. If previously in the adventure you did this, then follow this branch, otherwise follow this branch, and you get different outcomes depending on the player actions, which adds a level of flexibility and modularity to an adventure that we usually don't get to see. A lot of the time it is, this thing exists in the adventure world, here is how you'll deal with it, and then you don't get any more information. So it's nice that the players can feel like their choices have really mattered as they're going through the course of the adventure, and not feel as much as though they're on the rails. Now overall, this is quite a railroady adventure. You start in one place, you move from place A to B and can only move to B, then you move from B to C and C to D, and then D either back to C or over to E. In that sense, it is very linear, but the locations for each of those major places are big enough and wide enough that there is scope there for smaller adventures within them. So your players will start off in the carnival, that is one of your locations, but there's plenty to do in the carnival. They could spend a couple of in-game days there going back and forth, trying out the different rides and the different attractions before they move on into the Feywild. And then once they get to the Feywild, that is split into 4 distinct sections, and 3 of those are quite large, so there's quite a scope for them to take those sections in whatever order they want to. From the DM perspective, what this means is that you only have to prepare small chunks of content at a time. So in chapter 1, you need to know about the carnival, but what's happening in the Feywild does not matter to you. You don't need to worry about it. You just need to focus on the carnival, and the book will tell you what information you need to carry forward and note on the story tracker. Same in each section of the Feywild. You'll get there, the book will say, right, here is where you start in the Feywild, here is the map, here's the headline information for each section, and then the players can kind of go where they want in those contained areas, so they get the sandbox feel whilst also being in a contained space that is manageable for you as a dungeon master. I think if you compare that to something like Rime of the Frost Maiden, where there was 10 towns and the players could basically go anywhere at any time, you get a much more manageable adventure to run as the dungeon master, because you don't have to contend with as much information at any one time. I think the biggest problem people are going to have with this book is the tone. It is very much a fun and whimsical tone throughout the book, and you're either going to love that or you hate it. If it's not something that you enjoy, you won't enjoy any of the book, I'd dare to wager, because it is very consistent in its kind of magical and whimsical and fairy tale tone throughout the book. There are a number of characters that in any other setting would appear completely ridiculous, but fit in perfectly in this setting, like animated plants that are knights and have honeybee friends, or animated oil pots that can come alive and help the players. Those kind of things very much fit into the whimsical fantasy tone that the adventure sets out. That's not to say there aren't layers that you can add to it and darker undercurrents, because of course there are. It's the Feywild, you're always going to be able to incorporate those darker elements, but they are more contrasting because you are putting them against these fun whimsical things. Now, until my party were all slain in a TPK, they had a magical caravan, and I wish I had the rules from today's sponsor to be able to play around with. The Devil's Guide to Beastworld is a new 5th edition supplement that contains a wealth of options for players and GMs. The thing that gets me most excited about it is the modular caravan system. This allows your players to change and upgrade and improve a mobile home that goes with them where they go as they gain power and wealth and influence. I know that it can be hard for characters to feel like they have a home when they're moving around so much, so having a home that moves with them really helps them cement that bond and that connection to a place. Not only that, but the book contains 24 new playable races, as well as the homeland system, which replaces racial stats with a more cultural focused system. There's also a subclass for each of the 5th edition classes, as well as information on NPCs, shops, quest hooks, and an expansive travel section devoted to life on the road, perfect for a band of wandering adventurers. The project is already fully funded and it is smashing down stretch goals, and the Kickstarter is running until the 30th of September. You'll find a link in the description below, and thanks again to Heartleaf Games for supporting the channel. Let's do a lightning round of things that I really like about the book so we can cover some of those real quick. So first things first, I really like the leveling system. You gain a level each time you move from one major location to another, or defeat or overcome, I should say, one of the primary antagonists. So the leveling up system is really easy. You don't have to track XP, you don't have to think about when is the right time to milestone or what is going to be balanced for your party. You know exactly when they're going to move from one level to another. I really like all the references to time and the passing of time throughout the book. I love the connection between the Witchlight Carnival and the carnival that we got in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. More than any other book that I read in 5th edition, this one seemed to be a properly interconnected book. A lot of previous books make reference to previous events and things like that, and you are vaguely aware that they exist in the same universe. This is the first book where I felt like knowing information from another book gave me kind of an edge in this one, and I encountered characters that I was like, I know that character, and recognized them from another property, and that was a really cool connected universe feel, which I really enjoyed about the book. I really like the mood board in the carnival. It's a great way to kind of monitor your players' behavior and keep them from doing anything that is too disruptive. I love the Fae bargain connection, and there are multiple instances where you see the kind of corrupted nature of making a deal with the Fae, which is really cool. That was something I was really hoping to see in the book. And I love just the colourful characters that you meet. The book gives you a lot of options for characters that could potentially join you on an adventure, and I really think that that's one of the things that makes this a really strong contender for running if you have kids. So in my experience, when you play with kids, a lot of kids don't want to necessarily do the violent option. They want to make friends with fantastic creatures and go on an adventure, and that is perfect with this book. There are a lot of non-violent outcomes to everything. That is the default for every encounter, and there are a whole bunch of really strong characters in terms of kind of memorability that the kind of younger players could latch onto and bring along in their adventures. So the only other thing that I was a little bit disappointed with the book is that the antagonists, these 3 hags that have kind of taken over the Feywild, if you don't kill them, by the time you get to the end of the story, their kind of storyline is just sort of dropped. There's a reference that says, okay, the hags have gone here and we're not going to give you any information on it. You just have to sort that out on your own in the future. And that feels kind of anticlimactic. Depending on how you run it at the table, it might not be, but to have them escape and then the book just to say, okay, they're over here, but we're not going to give you any information, that's for you to deal with, did feel a little anticlimactic. But that could just be the player in me that wants the conflict. I suppose if the players are really invested in the story and they achieve their goals, maybe they're not going to care if the antagonists have gotten away. The ending options for this book are excellent, and there's a really bittersweet ending option which I really loved. I don't want to spoil it, but one of the options for what can happen after the adventure is concluded is really interesting, and I would like to see that played out. So overall, I was pleasantly surprised by this book. I think it is a great option if you are a newer dungeon master or someone that's never run an adventure book before, because of the way it presents all its information. And I really hope that this is an approach that Wizards of the Coast take forward into their future products. That story tracker alone, on its own, it's nothing amazing. You know, if they just put a story tracker at the back and that was it, I wouldn't be talking about it. But the fact that throughout the book they make reference to it and say, right, okay, this piece of information, track it on the story tracker. Here is where this character is, track it on the story tracker. It makes things much easier for you as a dungeon master to get your bearings and understand where you are and what's going on in the story. If you're interested in picking the book up, I'll leave affiliate links down in the description below. It doesn't cost you any extra, but it helps give the channel a kickback. And if you want more carnival themed goodness, check out my SIDEQUEST magazine. This month's issue is all about carnivals. There are 4 new carnival subclasses included in the book, information on carnival games and rides, and a whole bunch of other content. Link to that will be in the description below as well. But until next time, happy gaming.